So with that, we just have a set of initial questions that we were going to talk about, and then we want to open it up to you guys. So Dave, you want to come up and?
Oh yeah, Warren.
Why don't you come? Yeah, why don't you stay over there?
All right, I got it.
Okay, good. So this is just, I'll just start, because this is, I kind of see this as me asking Dave for help, because I have these systems that I build, and the parameters, you know, for example, so I have a large set of unknown parameters, and some of them are misspecified, and some of them aren't known, they're not there. And the way I approach it is I just tell everybody what I don't know, and I tell them the parameters that I'm setting, and I hope that they buy into it. And we do sensitivity analysis, but that's not really what I'm talking about, because the sensitivity analysis I do is with the parameters that I know, you know, and that's kind of, I'm just wondering, what are your comments on that idea?
All right, yeah. So, all right, great. And this is unrehearsed, so this is really going to be fresh. Yeah. Well, hopefully, no one brought any food in to throw. So starting with any sort of system that has a big involved model attached to it, I think that the starter questions are, all right, well, what data are available to inform this sort of thing, and what types of questions do you want to be able to address with this model? And so getting at those, the hope is that some of the questions kind of separate pieces of the model out and say, are there certain features of the model that you can attack first without necessarily having to get all the right features of the other components of the model, you know, nailed down, so that if we can kind of dissect the model a little bit and attack it in pieces, I'll feel like, okay, if we can get these sorts of things, we know we have data sources that inform different pieces of the model. We know that there's coupling, but it's not super strong between these components. Then I'll feel more comfortable with the fact that given the data that we do have, we might be able to start constraining this thing and getting this model to look a little more like reality.
Okay, let me ask you a question. So if I go, I'll just give you an example. I'm going to go back to this thing here. So one of the models I've just published recently, I have something kind of like this. It's school quality, right? So I know a little bit about school quality. And imagine I built this agent-based model of, it's like 64 neighborhoods. It's supposed to represent the United States. I'm looking at disparities in education and how that affects health behavior. So I have a couple papers that we've pulled from the education literature that tell us, and economics literature that tell us about changes in school quality. And it's basically a regression of coefficient that I put into my model. And it's part of my behavior. So if I'm in a school with a certain school quality, then the next year I either have a higher chance of smoking or less. And that's all I know about it. And there's a bunch of other parameters in there. So does that map onto any kind of problem you've dealt with?
It's big and it's loose, right? That right. Like we talked about the materials.
Let me add one thing. The data, I'll never get the data.
Let's go. We can not even n equals 1, huh? There won't be outcomes about, we know this many students began to smoke in this school or that many for that school or anything like that?
So maybe the data could, I would have to convince someone. I think Madoff said it, well, who said it? Once we have the money, you know, we can get whatever we want. So.
All right, so what's the goal of doing this experiment, this model?
Is to understand the relationship between socioeconomic disparities that pattern with or are correlated with racial, ethnic differences in the United States, and how that affects behaviors in health and cardiovascular disease.
So linkages between these sorts of things and
right.
smoking
and we have,
behavior.
Yeah. So we have, part of the issue is we're trying to look at what-if scenarios. So that's why we built the agent-based model.
All right. Anyone can ask questions now, because now I'm stumped.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure. I think
now's a good time to move into.
You want to move? Okay.
Group questions.
All right.
You guys are.
I had just one more thing before we go ahead and sit down.
Okay.
Before we go into that, let me just. I think we had one more thing here. Is it the arrow?
Forward arrow. Backward arrow.
Okay, so I just had one thing I wanted to share before we move into the Q&A. Now that you've seen a little bit about the lab and met a couple of our characters in the lab, and that really highlights the different kinds of disciplines we're coming together. What I wanted to do was just circle back a little bit about how interested we are in collaborating with VBI writ large and collaborating with all our colleagues across Virginia Tech. And we've started down that path a little bit, and I wanted to share an example that where we're collaborating with NDSSL and hopefully stretching ourselves in what we're trying to do, as well as stretching NDSSL and how they're thinking about some of their models. And this starts with a problem with some colleagues in Houston on air quality. That's Houston on a good day, maybe not. That's Houston on a bad day. There's been some great research that our colleagues have done that have demonstrated that localized concentration on a 3-hour window of air quality increases the risk of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest by 4.4%. It's a huge result because nearly 400,000 people in this country have an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and 90% die. So that's a serious issue. Now, what they can't do is to actually try to understand what's the populations at risk here. They only can do this based on knowing who had the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and attaching to them their exposure to the air quality in this localized time period. So they came and asked, well, the tools of NDSSL, could they possibly be used to help us understand that question, coupled with some of the data sources that we may want to be adding to those tools to generate different kinds of days and different kinds of normative behavior. So that's led us to actually coupling a couple things. And the first is building off of the synthetic information platform that NDSSL has for the Houston area, where the whole population gets built out, the 4.4 million people at their 1.8 million locations. And the beauty of this is that we know where those synthetic entities are at every moment of the day, which means that if we take an air quality model and try to attach it to this, we can actually get to the point where we can trace individuals. That top graph is tracing a family, each of the individuals in the family throughout 24 hours of the day, what their ozone exposure is. And the reason this is really important is, just like our colleagues said earlier, and as our colleagues said here, that this individual behavior matters. Because if I just average this, all of the effect washes out. The middle picture shows one of the Ship Channel neighborhoods in Houston, and the total exposure of the individuals that live in that area according to our synthetic model integration. What you see there is a lot of variability because people don't stay put, they don't stay home, they move around the city and they get exposed during the course of the day to whatever those values are. So I love this example. It's one of our first forays into really working together, where now we're going to be able to figure out how do we add a lot more health effects, a lot more other behaviors into this to be able to look at and look for health effects and what social disparities and other attributes come into play, which will feed into policy. So that's us, and we're really happy to be here, and now we'll answer questions.
Check. So part of it is just more like a, well, okay, I can cast this as a question. So this thing that and Maud have talked about, the within the skin constellation, the large data analytics piece and the continuation of questions you ask when you ask about health effects, for example, obviously goes into organization of health-related data, ultimately biologically referenced data, and the data analytics is going to be quite extensive. I mean, so you focus today on the social aspects of it, the behavioral aspects of it, and putting it together, but when you get to the place just where you're going to stick these things together, ultimately you're going to connect, to these other things. And I just, so the question is, I mean, it seems to me that would be true. So one question is, I guess, is that how you see this going? So my question is this, so when I look at, what we saw on this side, the Patrick style project, when I look at the synthetic information platforms, when I look at the kind of information that are generated for things like work patterns and cardiac problems or any number of other things, across VBI, across all these things, there seems to be some sort of central data analytics role here for the managing this collaborative bringing together of things. So of course we need sponsors and we need to do those things, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we might think about coordinating those kinds of problems, the basic collection and integration of the information we generate across this entire spectrum of work. That's really what this lab is kind of about. I mean, I know you say social on there, but it's a data analytics laboratory, and that's the full scope of what our problem is. And I just sort of like to see what you think of as a vision for you guys in that sort of setting.
Sally, we're going to make you go first.
You're going to make me go first. Okay, so what we see, what's interesting is we did I didn't show it, we did a little word analysis based on everything that we've written in the first 18 months of the lab. And the big central word, and it's on our poster that you'll see tonight, is data. And so it's the data analytics and the data piece, and really wanting to pull the data in, whether it's traditionally designed collections, administrative data, administrative records, digital data, or the really important massive amounts of generated data. So what I see as an organizing principle for that is going to be through much of what we saw with Patrick. Imagine data portals like Patrick in many different of the problem domains and relative to many of the different sponsors. And the tools like we saw for NDSSL, that these get incorporated in these portals so that we have access to that both as researchers and also our sponsors have access to that. So I think that we need to drive towards an organizing principle that actually allows that kind of access through a portal science type of paradigm. And one of the things that I was really struck with, and I've been struck with every time I see Patrick, for example, and I think it's the RNA rocket, where it goes through some detailed analysis of understanding data quality and sort of the representativeness of this information, and add on to that the possible use scenarios of it. And that needs to underpin all of what we're doing here and all of the tools and portals that we develop. So that's how I see it, and I think that SDAL can be incredibly good collaborators on sort of rounding this out.
Can I add one thing? Is this one? Check. So there's a quote by Phil Zuckerman. Theory without data is myth, and data without theory is madness. And the reason I say that is because the social part, a lot of the work that the substantive areas we're interested in, the theory part is essential as part of the data analytics. Otherwise, you're just driving data into nothing. That's how I see it.
And I'll add that looking wider, sort of VBI wide, right? And all right, we have social things that we want to focus on, but I think within VBI, in a larger kind of system, that how to combine data and models and make predictions is kind of universal theme there. And I think that our experience on that meta level with one type of model ought to carry over in large part to working with other types of models and applications. So I think from my perspective, that's a big lever for me coming here and what I would like to do. So yeah, I think that's definitely a very relevant point there.
And just one other thing, I mean, the theme that hasn't been brought up explicitly today is the information biology of going from molecules to policy. I guess it was reflected in NDSSL's talk. And so I think that SDAL helps anchor VBI on the societies and population end of that spectrum. But I am very excited for how we do figure out how to go from below the skin to above the skin to policy. And I think that we'll add some capability there.
I didn't realize that you folks felt your talks were in the siesta session. We were actually thinking the same, and we were planning a flash crowd Bollywood dance at the end. But we didn't have to do that.
There's still time.
No, but that was a prediction question I was going to ask Dave. Could you have predicted would we not do it or not? So I have a two-part question. One is, I think people have said that, in general, garbage in and then garbage out. I want to sort of change that thing a little bit, given the amount of data that we produce. My conjecture is that if you have a lot of data where most of it is garbage, and then this small bit of good piece, like we talked about junk DNA, or we talked about these things that Skip talked about, then I think it's actually useful data, and I wanted to see what statisticians felt. And a second part of the story is we have been very interested in procedural data, not just typical data that folks have worked with. And I think that's a very important class of data. You know, Chris has talked about it many times. As a computer scientist, I feel procedural data is actually the data in many ways. So could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure thing. So I think that this separating the data that you really need for what you're after versus the data that you don't need is huge, right? And this is where I think models are very, very important for that. That a lot of understanding what the model responds to and what it doesn't respond to tells you a lot about what the data you're going to need are versus what you maybe won't really need so much. Oh, there's another point that was sitting in there. Yeah. And I had no answer for the procedural part just yet. But that said, I think this opportunity of looking at a lot of different application areas, different types of models, different types of data, will help us form that sort of thing. And I don't think we're there yet on the procedural part, but I think that's important.
Well, and I think the procedural data piece is new compared to most groups that are working with it, and I think it's exciting to see how we're going to be able to make use of that, because I think it might actually get us to the point where some of the computation can be reduced and some of the uncertainty can even be reduced by using the procedural forms of data, versus, counting cars through intersections. Use the fact that you know how a light operates. So, but that's new. That's very new to be bringing, statistical scientists and quantitative social scientists into thinking about data in that way. So we're here.
Yep, great. Thank you so much for a very nice video and great presentation. We really appreciate it.